In the late 1960s, two musicals opened on Broadway, both of them in their own way protesting the activities of the United States government, but both of them doing so very differently. Hair did so by celebrating the hippie movement and challenging the social norms of the time. 1776, the subject of today's musical, took a somewhat subtler approach by going back to the birth of our nation and exploring the ideals on which it was founded, as well as the sacrifices that were made to make our nation, both by men in the battlefield and the men in Congress. The reason I mention these two musicals alongside of each other is because of a story connecting them. One rainy evening, the cast of Hair went to see a production of 1776, and so moved were they by that production that they went to the stage doors afterwards and formed a tunnel with their coats so that the cast of 1776 could get to their cars without getting wet. The 3-year run of the Broadway show came to a close in 1972, and that same year the movie adaptation was released, starring many of the original members of the cast, and for the most part sticking pretty closely to the original script. The movie is incredibly moving in its own way, but how does it stack up to the power of that stage production? Well, let's find out. Today's episode of From Stage
Hold it, Hatter.
What? You know what? It's the 4th of July. So? Fine. Things I do to get a cheap laugh around here. There. Much better. Thank you. Today's episode of From Stage to Screen looks at 1776. Let's start by looking at this particular performance. As Hatter mentioned, many of the leads from the original Broadway production reprised their roles in the movie. The main protagonist is John Adams, representative from Massachusetts, who has been trying for months to get Congress to just have one lousy debate on the issue of independence from Great Britain. Unfortunately, he has rallied little support in Congress around this idea because he is obnoxious and disliked. Finally, though, he gained some traction as Richard Henry Lee from Virginia brings a resolution to Congress to be debated on. And now that there is support outside of New England, Congress is split down the middle. With a unanimous vote being required for passage of the resolution, John Adams, along with Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, must convince those voting nay that yes, King George really has committed these atrocities, or yes, our army can stand up to the military might of Great Britain, or no, of course we're not going to take away your slaves. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson continues to pen the Declaration, and letter after letter from General Washington describe the dire situation at the front. Reprising his role as John Adams in the movie is none other than William Daniels. Yes, you heard right, John Adams is played by none other than Mr. Feeney. That alone counts for plenty of awesome points. And he plays the part well. He's brusque and often irritating and very persistent, but you can sense the passion that he has for this idea, and even the self-doubts he has about his own abilities as a leader. Howard DeSalvo plays the more humorous but equally passionate Benjamin Franklin, and he also does a good job portraying the humor of the character, but also the toughness and wisdom. Ken Howard rounds out the main trio as Thomas Jefferson, and this is the one performance that I'm really not all that crazy about. Jefferson's a hard role to play. You have to be quiet and soft-spoken, but you also have to have just as much passion for this idea as Adams and Franklin. I get the quietness in Howard's performance, but he kind of underplays the passion, and unfortunately he often comes off as bored. John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, the loudest voice against independence, is also a difficult role to pull off. He's technically the main antagonist, but he's one of the few people in Congress who is actually opposing independence because he honestly believes it's a bad idea, and not just for political reasons. His passion for reconciliation with Great Britain is equal to Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson's passion for independence, so much so that he actually leaves Congress rather than sign the Declaration. But at the same time, he still loves his country and chooses to fight for it in the army. And through all of that, he just plain doesn't like Adams. That's a pretty nuanced character, and he too often comes off as really just slimy. Donald Madden, who plays him in the movie, does alright, but I would have liked to have seen just a little bit more humanity from this character. The rest of the cast plays their parts well, each of them coming from a different place, a different experience, and each of them either supporting or denouncing independence for their own individual reasons. It's a well-done performance with only a couple of exceptions, so it gets a pass from me. Let's take a look at setting. This is admittedly a pretty strange setting for a musical. I mean, Philadelphia, 1776, the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence as a musical? Okay, so how exactly did they get this to work? Well, this is another example of a musical functioning as a musical should. Most of the songs either move the plot forward, get into the heads of one or several of our characters, or are impassioned speeches or pleas. We've talked in the past about the two different ways to handle reality in stage productions, whether you're sticking strictly to reality with authentic costumes and sets and props and so on, or if you're allowing yourself to suspend reality a little bit and just suggest things. 1776 does a little bit of both. On the one hand, the costumes are usually period, the set usually looks like the signing room of Independence Hall circa 1776, and the actors usually are made to look like the historical figures. Incidentally, I'm going to be referring to the building where they signed the Declaration of Independence as Independence Hall, even though I realized at the time it was not called Independence Hall. And since this is an historical event that people are familiar with, it has to have those familiar historical roots. But at the same time, they do take a number of liberties. Critics have pointed out the number of historical inaccuracies in this show, and yeah, they're there. We hear familiar quotes, but the context is probably slightly different. The idea for writing a declaration was probably not a desperate act to stall for time. And of course, the members of the Second Continental Congress did not spontaneously get up and sing and dance. But this isn't meant to be a documentary of that time period, and the moments where they do suspend reality are really well done. Easily my favorite scenes are the letters exchanged between John and Abigail Adams. Periodically throughout the show, John and Abigail will exchange letters with each other, but in the context of the show, they actually get to have a conversation. And the writing manages to get them actually talking, but still make it seem like they're just writing letters to each other. These sequences add a human element to the character of John Adams, as well as introduce the kick-ass character that is Abigail. So how does the movie handle this balance between reality and not? Well, they've got the reality down pretty well. In fact, they're able to do a little bit more with it, because it's a movie, that's what movies do. Most stage productions of 1776 just have one set, the set of Independence Hall, and then the rest of the scenes that are outside of Independence Hall are done on the apron of the stage. But in the movie, we get to see the other parts of Philadelphia circa 1776. We get to see Jefferson's home, and we get to see some other parts of the building where they signed the Declaration. In particular, I like the bits that they do with Adams up in the bell tower. Also, most stage productions have to condense the number of members of Congress to the people that actually have speaking parts, whereas the movie is able to get a bunch of extras to fill in the extra members of Congress. So what about the other side of it, the non-reality side of it? It's kind of hit and miss, but they do have the right idea. When they suspend reality, they don't half-ass it. Just like stage versions use stage magic to suspend reality, this movie uses various movie-making methods to suspend reality. The best example of this is easily in the song Cool Considerate Men, which probably technically shouldn't be part of this review since it wasn't in the original film, but screw it, I'm using it anyway. While our conservative members of Congress are dancing and singing about why they're conservative, a dispatch comes from the front talking about the dire situation and how much they need help from Congress. So we get this very haunting sequence of this very dark dispatch being read while the members of Congress dance merrily away, completely oblivious to their surroundings and what's going on. It's an extremely powerful scene, and we will talk more about it in later rounds. The sequences that work less brilliantly, that's more of a problem with cinematography and editing than it is with the actual idea of setting. As far as the actual conceptualization of reality versus non-reality, they still have that balance that the stage musical does. The movie is real when it needs to be, suspended when it needs to be, and it balances that line very, very well. And so for that, I give it a pass with distinction. Round 3 gets us into the cinematography and editing that Hatter was talking about. It sucks. Yeah, this is really the only legitimately bad thing about this movie. Well, no, okay, to be fair, the cinematography isn't that bad. In fact, the main reason why the Cool Considerate Men sequence is so effective is because of the cinematography. The same goes for the following song, Mama Look Sharp. But that being said, there are some weird things in the cinematography as well. For example, several of the shots of the congressional sessions use a really long shot that's really way far in the distance from what's happening. And I guess they were trying to capture the feel of watching a stage production, but the thing is, in an actual stage production, an actor has the ability to throw focus and show the audience where they should be throwing their attention, much like camera angles do in a movie. So this doesn't really feel like watching a stage production as much as it feels like watching an amateur bootleg recording of a stage production. But, as Scotty said, the real problem is with the editing. Now, this isn't the world's most fast-paced show to begin with. It's very dialogue-heavy, but the passion and the ideas should take care of that. But the movie's editing just makes the slow pace of this show 10 times worse. And I'm not just talking about the low-budget effects, though those are a treat as well. The cuts are just so incredibly slow at times that it just feels like the actors aren't picking up on their cues fast enough. One of the longest stretches of dialogue comes in Scene 3, which is the scene where the resolution for independence is presented to Congress and debated on. About half an hour passes where there is no music at all, and in the midst of that comes a debate on the pros and cons of independence. And this is the scene where most productions of 1776 will get bogged down. If this scene moves too slowly, if the actors aren't picking up on their cues, if a lot of lines are being dropped, or if they're just not being passionate enough in their arguments, then the energy of this scene will just drop straight to the ground. And that's the sense I get watching this scene. The slow cuts, the long shots, and even to a certain extent how subtly the actors are playing it, which there's normally not anything wrong with, but because of how everything else is moving so slow, it just makes the scene incredibly dull. The sound mixing is off, cuts often come in strange places, and there are a lot of unnecessary things added, like the snare drum roll before they read George Washington's name. It's just sloppy. If the film has one fault, it's the editing, and unfortunately, it's a pretty major fault. This film runs a good 3 hours, and there's no reason why, with a little bit of cleaner editing, they couldn't have shaved at least 30 minutes off of the overall running time. So for this category, the movie gets a fail. And finally, how well did this movie transition to the big screen overall? Well, as we've already talked about, some transitions worked, and some didn't. What the movie essentially sought to do, I think, was polarize the two types of reality, and seem the realistic sections seem more authentic, and the non-realistic sections seem more suspended from reality. Does it work? Well, the realistic portions certainly do. The movie looks period, at least in my somewhat uncritical eye, and I do like that we actually get to see some parts of Philadelphia outside of Independence Hall. The main thing it does is place the story in context. The suspended parts, well, some of them work, like Cool Considerate Men, Mama Look Sharp, and Molasses to Run to Slaves. And a lot of the faults here come from bad editing and low budget effects, which for the most part we can forgive. Though I do think that at times they try a little bit too hard to suspend reality, and a lot of these scenes come off just looking goofy. But I still give the movie credit for trying at least, and the good parts were very good. And for the most part, they stuck pretty closely to the script. The only places where they really deviated were to add things to put this movie in a broader context. But I don't really think that these additions were necessary just because the setting of the movie should have done that well enough. But these additions are relatively brief and they don't really distract from the overall story. Now, before I give the final grade to this movie, I need to address the Cool Considerate Men issue. About midway through the show, all the liberals have, for whatever reason, left Congress, leaving the conservatives behind. And John Dickinson leads them in a song where they basically sing about why they are conservative and why they feel it's important to maintain the status quo. The gist of the song is basically, we're pretty well off the way we are right now, why should we change? And I already talked about the incredibly powerful suspension of reality that comes in the middle of this song. This is a very powerful sequence. When the film was originally released, however, this scene was conspicuously absent. Why? Time reasons? Lack of musical ability on the part of the guy who played Dickinson? No and no. The song and dance sequence were in fact recorded and shot and in the original cut of the movie. However, after seeing an advanced screening of the film, who should contact the director but President Nixon? Next thing they knew, the director was ordering that the scene be cut from the movie and every copy of it, including the original negatives, be destroyed. Despite the fact, it should be noted, that scenes from that song sequence were in the movie trailer. And that would have been the end of it, and that scene never would have seen the light of day again, if not for the actions of an anonymous staff flunky who stole the negatives from the cutting room floor and smuggled them out. And so the scene lives on in the DVD release of 1776. You gotta love a story that includes righteous rebellion, an uncredited flunky, and evidence of what a douchebag Nixon was. So maybe I shouldn't include Cool Considerate Men as part of this comparison since it wasn't in the original release of the film, but while the director of the film might have been intimidated by President Nixon, I'm not. Probably because he's dead, but still. And if nothing else, that story speaks to the incredible power of that scene. Admittedly, Nixon was pretty paranoid, but the fact that he was so intimidated by this scene from a movie that he ordered it destroyed just speaks volumes for it. So, despite its faults, 1776 does make the transition from stage to screen very well, and I give it a pass. So with 2 passes and 1 pass with distinction, 1776 gets an acceptable. And that does it for another episode of From Stage to Screen. You know, Scotty, we've done 3 of these now, and they've all gotten passing grades. I'm sure that there are bad movie adaptations of stage productions out there, but I just can't think of any. Oh, there's a doozy out there, Hatter. Try to remember. Try to remember. Aw,
And now that you've achieved it, I don't expect anything less.
You know, you take the joy out of everything.
Thanks.